Breaking tonight. The United States Department of Justice just handed Congress what they're calling transparency. 3.5 million pages of Jeffrey Epstein documents dumped onto the public record in what officials are celebrating as complete compliance with federal law. But here's the question that should be keeping every American awake tonight. If the DOJ identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages in their investigation, where the hell are the other 2.5 million? That's not a rounding error. That's not a bureaucratic oversight. That's 40% of the evidence sitting in a vault somewhere in Washington, while lawmakers threaten to charge the Attorney General with contempt of Congress, and survivors of Epstein's abuse are calling this what it really is, a cover-up disguised as cooperation. This isn't about conspiracy theories or internet speculation anymore. This is about elected representatives from both sides of the aisle, standing on the floor of the United States Congress, and saying out loud what millions of Americans have been thinking in private. Someone at the highest levels of our government is protecting someone. And tonight, we're going to follow the paper trail, decode the congressional fury, and expose exactly why the biggest document dump in DOJ history might actually be the biggest misdirection play Washington has pulled in decades. The stakes couldn't be higher, because when the federal government decides what truth you're allowed to see and what truth gets buried in classified archives, we're not talking about national security. We're talking about a two-tiered justice system where power writes its own rules and accountability becomes a performance for the camera. Let's cut through the noise and establish the timeline that matters. On January 21st, 2026, the Department of Justice announced with great fanfare that they were unsealing 3.5 million responsive pages in compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Legislation that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support because Americans across every political divide agreed on one fundamental principle. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The press release from Maine Justice read like a victory lap. Officials characterized this as one of the most comprehensive transparency efforts in the history of federal law enforcement. News networks ran with headlines celebrating the release. For approximately 48 hours, it looked like the system was actually working. Then Representative Ro Khanna, a Democrat from California's Silicon Valley, stood up during a congressional hearing and dropped a bombshell that changed everything. The Justice Department, Khanna revealed, had in fact identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages during their review process. Not 3.5 million, 6 million, which means that somewhere in the labyrinth of DOJ databases and FBI field office filing cabinets, there are 2.5 million pages of documents that match the legal criteria for disclosure under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and the American people aren't being allowed to see them. When Khanna pressed DOJ officials for an explanation during testimony, the answers were evasive, technical, wrapped in the kind of bureaucratic language that sounds reasonable until you actually parse what's being said. Phrases like ongoing equities and investigative sensitivities and parallel proceedings filled the hearing transcript. Translation: trust us, you don't need to know. But here's why this matters to ordinary Americans right now, today, in February 2026. This isn't ancient history. Jeffrey Epstein died in federal custody in August 2019, under circumstances that the DOJ's own Inspector General called a perfect storm of screw-ups. Broken cameras, sleeping guards, a cellmate mysteriously transferred hours before Epstein's death. His co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, is serving 20 years in federal prison, convicted of sex trafficking minors. And yet, despite years of investigation, despite mountains of evidence, despite victim testimony that detailed a systemic operation involving multiple locations and dozens of enablers, not a single other person has been charged with participating in Epstein's trafficking network. FBI Director Kash Patel went on record saying there was no credible information showing Epstein trafficked girls to others. The FBI, with 6 million pages of documents, claims there's no evidence that a man who ran a private island, multiple properties, and a private jet nicknamed the Lolita Express was doing anything other than acting alone. The American public isn't buying it. Neither is Congress. And that's what makes this moment so volatile. When you have representatives like Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, posting on social media that he cannot be bullied and is not done pushing for full disclosure, and Democrats like Jamie Raskin saying he saw tons of completely unnecessary redactions and names redacted for mysterious or baffling or inscrutable reasons. You're watching a rare moment of bipartisan rage. These are lawmakers who've actually seen the unredacted versions. They've sat in secure facilities and read what the DOJ doesn't want you to know. And what they're saying publicly is chilling. The government is protecting predators while re-victimizing survivors. That's not political rhetoric. That's an accusation of institutional corruption from the people with security clearances high enough to know the truth. So let's dive into what we actually know about these 3.5 million pages that were released, because understanding what the DOJ gave us is the only way to understand what they're hiding. The production, according to official statements, may include fake or falsely submitted images and documents, because everything sent to the FBI by the public was included. That's important context. The DOJ is essentially admitting that they dumped raw, unverified tips and public submissions into this release, which had the convenient effect of diluting the actual investigative material with noise. It's a tactic as old as intelligence work itself. When you want to hide a needle, you don't destroy the haystack. You make the haystack so massive that finding the needle becomes impossible. But even within this intentionally chaotic release, patterns emerge that are absolutely damning. NPR conducted a review and found numerous examples where the Justice Department failed to redact names of publicly identified victims and names of individuals who have not been publicized. We're talking about more than 3,000 pages that revealed sensitive information about Epstein victims, nude photos showing faces of potential victims, names, email addresses, and other identifying information either completely unredacted or not fully obscured. One survivor told CNN directly that the DOJ was shielding predators. Another said the Justice Department protected the Epstein class with blanket redactions. These are women who lived through this nightmare, going on the record to accuse the United States government of protecting their abusers. The redaction pattern itself tells a story. The Justice Department redacted details of individuals who may have aided the convicted sex offender. Co-conspirators in a draft indictment from the 2000s had their names blacked out. Meanwhile, victims, many of whom were minors when they were trafficked, had their identities exposed. Think about the optics of that for a second. The government spent resources to protect the anonymity of alleged criminals while failing to protect the privacy of crime victims. That's not an accident. That's a choice, and it reveals exactly whose interests the DOJ is prioritizing. Then there's the content of what was revealed in the documents that weren't fully redacted. And it's beyond disturbing. Emails from 2014 where a sender whose name remains protected by the DOJ writes to Epstein, "Thank you for a fun night. Your littlest girl was a little naughty." Another email from 2018 where a redacted sender tells Epstein, "I found at least 3 very good young poor, but we was so tired." The broken English suggesting either a non-native speaker or someone trying to communicate in code. Perhaps most horrifying is a 2017 email where someone writes to Epstein about a woman they met, saying, "She is like Lolita from Nabokov, femme miniature, so now I should send you her type of candidates only." For those unfamiliar, Lolita is Vladimir Nabokov's 1955 novel about a middle-aged man who sexually abuses a 12-year-old girl. These people weren't being subtle. They were referencing pedophilia in literary terms, treating the procurement of children like a business transaction. And the Department of Justice knows exactly who sent these emails. They have the metadata, the IP addresses, the email accounts, but they've chosen to keep those names classified. Inside the corridors of power in Washington, the pressure is building. After the initial release, lawmakers publicly shamed the DOJ into unredacting some additional names. Billionaire Les Wexner, the former CEO of Victoria's Secret parent company L Brands, and Epstein's longtime benefactor, appeared as a named co-conspirator. Leslie Groff, Epstein's longtime assistant, was named. Jean-Luc Brunel, a former French modeling agent who died in a Paris jail cell in 2022 while awaiting trial on rape charges connected to Epstein, was listed. These weren't revelatory. Investigative journalists had connected these individuals to Epstein years ago. The fact that the DOJ initially tried to protect their identities tells you everything about the department's real intentions. But here's where it gets even darker. A 2011 email revealed Jeffrey Epstein's plans to help seize Libya's frozen state assets, which Epstein estimated at $80 billion. He was seeking the help of British and Israeli intelligence to seize the funds in exchange for a 10 to 25% compensation fee. That's up to $20 billion for what amounts to state-sponsored theft. This wasn't a sex trafficker operating in the shadows. This was someone with connections to foreign intelligence agencies, discussing the seizure of a sovereign nation's wealth during the Arab Spring, treating geopolitical chaos as a business opportunity. And the question that should terrify every American is this: if Epstein was operating at that level, with those connections, who exactly was he working for? Government knew about it. Representative Jared Moskowitz, after viewing some of the unredacted files in a secure congressional facility, described the content as just gross, and revealed that a list of Epstein's co-conspirators would surprise the public because a lot of them were women. That statement alone should trigger alarm bells. We're conditioned to think of sex trafficking operations as run exclusively by men, but the reality, as prosecutors in the Maxwell case proved, is that women often play crucial roles as recruiters, groomers, and managers who make victims feel safe before delivering them to predators. The DOJ knows who these women are. Congress knows who these women are. The American people don't know who these women are. Now, let's zoom out and understand the international implications, because this isn't just a domestic scandal. It's a geopolitical crisis that's actively undermining American credibility on the world stage. The Epstein network, as revealed in these documents, wasn't confined to Manhattan townhouses and Caribbean islands. This was a global operation with tentacles reaching into the power centers of American allies and adversaries alike. When emails surfaced showing Epstein discussing torture videos with Sultan bin Sulayem, an Emirati businessman, you're looking at potential compromising material that could be used to manipulate officials in Middle Eastern allies. When documents reveal connections to British intelligence operations and Israeli assets, you're seeing the architecture of an influence network that transcends borders. Steve Bannon, former White House chief strategist and one of the most politically connected figures in American conservatism, sat down with Jeffrey Epstein in the summer of 2019, just weeks before Epstein's arrest, and filmed 16 hours of footage for a documentary he titled The Monsters: Epstein's Life Among the Global Elite. During that interview, Bannon pressed Epstein about whether his money was dirty, and Epstein said no, claiming, "I earned it." Think about the timing. This was after the Miami Herald had published its bombshell investigation. This was after Epstein had already served time in Florida on solicitation charges. This was when anyone with half a brain could see the walls closing in. And yet, Bannon, a man with security clearances, a man who'd served in the White House, sat down for 16 hours of conversation and filmed it all. That documentary has never been released. What's on those tapes? What did Epstein tell someone he presumably thought he could trust about his connections, his clients, his operation? The geopolitical stakes couldn't be higher because the Epstein files contain evidence of American citizens, some of them in positions of significant power, being potentially compromised by foreign intelligence services. When you have a trafficking network that documented everything, that kept videos and photos as a matter of protocol, you're talking about blackmail material that could be sitting in the hands of adversaries. Russia, China, Iran, they don't need to hack the DOJ servers. They just need to have been paying attention when Epstein was operating. The 2.5 million missing pages almost certainly contain intelligence assessments about who was compromised, who might have been an asset, and who represents an ongoing national security threat. The DOJ's refusal to release that material isn't about protecting victims. It's about protecting the intelligence equities of people who may have put themselves in compromising positions. Our allies are watching this circus with a mixture of horror and schadenfreude. When American officials lecture other nations about corruption, about transparency, about the rule of law, foreign diplomats can now point to the Epstein files and say, "You can't even hold your own predator class accountable." The moral authority of the United States, already damaged by decades of policy failures and military interventions, takes another hit every single day this material remains classified. And our enemies are taking notes. They're watching how American institutions respond when powerful people are implicated. They're learning the lesson that in the United States, if you're connected enough, if you're valuable enough to the right people, you can traffic children and die old in a federal cell without ever naming names. That's not the message a superpower should be broadcasting. So here we are, America. 3.5 million pages released, 2.5 million pages hidden, and a Justice Department that's hoping you'll be satisfied with the spectacle of transparency while the substance remains locked away. Congressional representatives are threatening contempt charges. Survivors are calling it a cover-up. Bipartisan fury is building in the halls of Congress. And the American people are being told, once again, to trust institutions that have given them absolutely no reason to trust. Here's what we know beyond any doubt. Jeffrey Epstein ran a systematic operation that trafficked underage girls to wealthy and powerful men for decades. He did this openly enough that journalists, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies all knew about it. He was arrested, given a sweetheart deal in Florida, continued his operation, and then died in federal custody under circumstances that even the government admits were suspicious. His co-conspirator was convicted, and yet, despite 6 million pages of documentation, despite victim testimony, despite flight logs and property records and financial transactions, not one other person has been charged with participating in this network. The missing 2.5 million pages represent more than just documents. They represent accountability. They represent the names of the powerful people who used Epstein's network. They represent the evidence of how many girls were trafficked, to whom, and for how long. They represent the international connections that turned a sex trafficking operation into a potential intelligence asset. And they represent the last chance for the American justice system to prove that the rule of law actually means something when the people being investigated are wealthy and connected. Representative Thomas Massie said he cannot be bullied and is not done fighting for full disclosure. He's right to fight. Because if we allow the Department of Justice to decide which truths are convenient and which truths are dangerous, we're not citizens of a republic anymore. We're subjects of a bureaucracy. If we accept that 40% of the evidence can simply disappear into classification because it might embarrass powerful people, we're endorsing a system where justice is negotiable and transparency is theater. The 2.5 million missing pages are still out there. They're sitting in DOJ databases, backed up on government servers, locked in cabinets and field offices across the country. They contain names, they contain evidence, they contain truth. And the only question that matters now is whether the American people are going to demand to see them, or whether we're going to let this moment pass like so many others. Another scandal that gets memory hold, another cover-up that becomes accepted history, another reminder that there are two justice systems in this country, and most of us aren't in the one that matters. Inside the corridors of power in Washington, they're counting on you to move on. They're betting that you'll get distracted by the next news cycle, the next crisis, the next manufactured outrage. They're hoping that 3.5 million pages is enough to satisfy your hunger for truth, that you won't do the math and realize they're hiding 40% of the story. They're gambling that Americans are too exhausted, too cynical, too beaten down by years of institutional failure to keep demanding answers. Don't let them win that bet, because the moment we stop asking questions, the moment we accept that some crimes are too big to prosecute and some criminals are too important to name, we lose something fundamental about what this country is supposed to be. We lose the idea that all men are created equal. We lose the principle that no one is above the law. We lose the promise that justice, however imperfect, is still possible. The Epstein Files scandal isn't over. It's just beginning. And what happens next depends entirely on whether Americans are willing to look at their government and say 2.5 million pages, we want them all. No more excuses, no more redactions, no more protection for predators while survivors get hung out to dry. The stakes couldn't be higher. Because this isn't really about Jeffrey Epstein anymore. It's about us. It's about whether we still have the courage to demand that our institutions serve justice instead of power. The choice, America, is yours. What are you going to do about it?